how the corona waves behave and how the responsibility is perceived by the state leaders. Extract from the 748th contact of July 27, 2020, translated with deepl.com. The following is an unauthorized, unofficial translation.
Thank you. That should be clear and detailed enough. For my part, I was only brief with my explanations. But my explanations were understood nevertheless. But I find your clarification much better, thank you. But what I want to ask you, my friend, although we actually didn't want to talk about corona anymore, is something that is on the one hand unclear and on the other hand wrong. Recently, several TV stations and states have claimed that the second wave of the coronavirus is now spreading through the country, whereas in Hong Kong there is already a third wave spreading, which brings disaster. In addition, I notice daily in the latest news from Swiss and German news channels, as well as worldwide, that false statements are constantly being made about the number of cases, corona infections and corona deaths, which contradict yours.
What I can explain and clarify about this is something that will probably interest many people. Why you should spread the whole thing on the Figure website explaining it, to counteract the false reports that are spread irresponsibly misleadingly towards the people. But it also concerns what is claimed about the alleged second and third corona wave, whereby such false reports are not infrequently made by virologists and immunologists, but also by pathological know-it-alls, conspiracy theorists and fear propagators, etc. Both in this respect and in dealing with the corona pandemic, the majority of terrestrial human beings are obviously just as unteachable as the majority of those responsible for the state, who should be concerned for the safety of their peoples, but they are not. This is not because they consider the running and operation of economic groups to be more important and much more important than the health and lives of the people, but it is equally true for the majority of the population itself, which, contrary to its respect for health and life, indulges and pursues its many pleasures irresponsibly and indifferently, and consequently the corona epidemic cannot be stopped, but is spreading and claiming more and more victims, by compulsively maintaining the largely old ways of working of the economic groups, instead of adjusting the whole thing to a lower and health and safety conscious stock of labor and adequate production. Everything is ruthlessly carried on in the old style, with the consent of the state leaders, who would be responsible for devising, enforcing and complying with all the necessary health and safety measures to prevent the epidemic from spreading any further. As far as the spread and the worldwide spread of the corona disease is concerned, the first wave is still going on, which, depending on the safety behavior of the terrestrial people, flattens out, rises again and even rises, only to fall off again strongly if the safety measures are strictly observed. But then, if these measures are again relaxed or neglected, the wave spreads further and further. So the fact is that so far the first wave is still active, which is still expanding and only comes to an end when it reaches its most intensive and highest level worldwide, then flattens out and reaches an earth-wide low overall, and only then a second wave can build up and start to spread again. With such a second or possibly even third wave, it can again spread worldwide as a pandemic, but it is also possible that only individual countries will be affected and the disease will again spread only as a national epidemic. Claims to the contrary correspond to confused falsehoods or effective stupidity, which in any case means and arises from the fact that and when man does not consciously and rationally analyze an incidental matter, gains inconclusive insights and thus remains ignorant and incapable of making an informed judgment. This, if man is able to think consciously and rationally, but does not make use of it, then a state of stupidity arises, and this state prevails in the majority of peoples as well as in their leaderships, which is why they do not seek the necessary health and safety measures and cannot prescribe or enforce them, which results in many victims.
You have often said in the last months privately, as well as recently again, it was probably still in the month of June, that already in a short time, just in the near future or so, by the currently still rampant and effective first corona pandemic wave, which is still rolling over the whole earth, until the autumn to the or over 22 million people infected by the coronavirus and over 1 million corona disease deaths will be lamented.
Unfortunately, this is the result of this way of thinking, which is the fault of all those of the majority of the state leaders who, in their inability to lead, initiated and continue to initiate the relaxation or lifting of the lockdown orders, thereby leaving the people free to decide for themselves whether or not they want to be subject to personal security measures. This has now led to the majority of the population's ignorant, stupid and reckless people using the lifting of the lockdown as stupidly as before, which means that tens of thousands of people around the world are once again being reinfected by the coronavirus, just as other tens of thousands are provoking and causing their own deaths, as many others have done before and have done so far. And what is now going to happen in this respect in Europe, which until recently was spared from large numbers of infections and victims as a result of the more or less effective and state-imposed safety precautions, will now, as a result of the end of the lockdown, also be severely affected by the corona epidemic and claim many victims. However, this is also happening worldwide and has already begun, but it is only now that the primary wave or fundamental wave, which is still expanding worldwide, will peak in Europe and quickly claim large masses of infections and fatalities.
Unfortunately, as you said recently, this will also be in Switzerland.
This is unavoidable, because in your homeland, too, those state officials who would be responsible for the general security and health and thus also for the protection and welfare of the people and their lives, consist of absolutely incompetent male and female persons of the federal government and, as a failure in state leadership, should never be allowed to hold such a position. All those loudmouths in the government who would be responsible and accountable for civil protection with regard to all the necessary protective measures against the prevailing corona epidemic, as far as the Federal Council members of both sexes are concerned in Switzerland, are incapable of their great responsibility to recognize, collect and implement the necessary precautionary measures against the coronavirus and make a mockery of themselves. This is because they are not aware of their responsibility and duty to maintain the health and well-being of the people, and they are not able to identify the precarious danger of the corona disease, nor to devise the necessary precautions against the disease, and therefore cannot have any carried out. The mere fact that in Switzerland the state leaders and authorities responsible for the protective measures are acting irresponsibly, namely by omitting a general obligation to wear protective masks or the obligatory wearing of protective masks at all for the health and safety of all persons for precarious places, is more than just criminal carelessness. And the fact that for the entire population of all states, including Switzerland, all group gatherings are not strictly forbidden, that there is no closure of entertainment venues, no prohibition of public entertainment and commemoration ceremonies etc., and no prohibition of holidays etc., will continue to claim many victims of the corona epidemic, and this will continue to be the case in relation to the whole of all other appropriate distance from person to person, wherever this is necessary and where the need for protection makes it indispensable. But if all this is not done, then this kind of inaction is irresponsible, because the need to comply with these rules exists wherever people are forced to do things that cannot be avoided and are in close proximity to other people, such as on public transport, in shopping centers, at work, etc., as well as in postal and banking services and, in general, in all busy places, etc.
You said all that stuff about other things, too, as I recall.
This is indeed the case, but it is true of all leaders worldwide, with only a tiny minority that would have real leadership qualities. But these are not effective against the power-hungry. If data are published worldwide that relate to the corona pandemic, then it can be explained by the fact that all over the world, health control institutes report false data from infected and dead people in relation to the epidemic, because not all cases are recorded and not all cases are reported. This is also true in Switzerland, where the infection and death rates are much higher than those reported and also mentioned publicly. However, this is true for all countries worldwide, such as Germany in Europe, where the death rate has been over 11,000 for some time, whereas only around 9,190 deaths are officially reported at present. Also, the mentioned so-called case numbers concerning the corona epidemic, which are reported daily, do not correspond to the facts. What is correct, however, is that the total number of corona infections and corona deaths worldwide is 4 times higher than is generally wrongly calculated, because all effective facts are neither really recognized nor researched. It is unavoidable to mention that the earthly technology of all kinds, which is highly praised by the earthly people, is indeed still so deficient and underdeveloped that with this technology it is in no way possible to analyze and register all things very exactly and precisely down to an individual person, as it is possible on the other hand with our much higher and further developed technology. According to this fact, we also have decidedly better and moreover extremely exact and precise records of each and every criterion that we investigate and check, so that we are able to find out and register every single human being on Earth who is infected by the coronavirus or who has died, which is not possible with the entire earthly high technology and will not be possible for several centuries. The modern technology alone, which is still in the early stages of a higher development, represents a great danger for the continued existence of the earthly humanity, because as a result of its underdevelopment of consciousness, all conceivable old and new inventions of all kinds, values and unvalues are always immediately transformed into weapons, destruction, extermination and extermination operas, and thus disaster, wars, murders and terror are carried out. With regard to any earthly high technology, which is arrogantly called high technology by the earthly people, our pledge Ericksonian effective high technology is absolutely superior to any earthly technology. This corresponds to a criterion and a characteristic that is relevant for a distinction, evaluation or decision with regard to every technical evolution and its peaceful, progressive, logical fulfillment, and thus especially oriented towards the laws of creation. However, this is impossible for terrestrial human beings with regard to the existence as well as the use of the still deeply underdeveloped terrestrial technology in all its types, forms and products, as well as with regard to its use in any selection of persons, objects, characteristics, occurrences or subjects etc. Is the whole thing considered since the beginning of the corona epidemic, especially due to ignorance of the facts that have been established by the terrestrial virologists, immunologists, epidemiologists and medical specialists etc., that the corona danger was not researched either from the beginning of 2019, when the coronavirus first appeared, or in the months after that until the end of November, so it could work unnoticed for months and cause many infections and deaths, until the first public case became known in Wuhan by a certain coincidence. What is more, it should be mentioned that certain sections of the responsible heads of state and authorities in all the countries of the world have recklessly judged the whole of the dangerous nature of the coronavirus to be a trivial and insignificant matter, or very weak and harmless, and is still considered harmless in various irresponsible ways. However, this was and is also the case in large parts of the population, especially among pathologically stupid people who are indifferent and thoughtless. but also among confused know-it-alls and completely irresponsible conspiracy theorists, who make everything degenerate in such a way that all indispensable safety precautions are inevitably trivialized and disregarded. As a result, the necessary duty to wear protective masks is largely abolished, ridiculed and, moreover, the state authorities leave it to the discretion of the population in various places, so that such protective measures or the wearing of protective masks can be determined according to the personal decision of the individual person, which brings corona infections for many people on Earth and also leads to an ever-increasing number of corona deaths, which will soon exceed the official million mark. This will soon follow the 20 million officially named infections, which will be disclosed in just 1 week. However, this will not lead to a fact of reason, because the entire economy and the associated commerce as well as the financial power will continue to be the more important side of all unreasonableness and will therefore continue to occupy, contrary to the necessary security with regard to the health and life of the earthly people in general. Thanks to this irrational and illogical way of thinking, acting and behaving, the corona death rate will inevitably rise alarmingly fast and, in addition to the corona death victims who have exceeded the million mark for some time now, the number of millions of deaths will very quickly be officially mentioned. In addition to the millions of corona deaths which have already exceeded the million mark for some time, the millions of deaths are also very quickly officially mentioned. In addition to all this, it is unfortunately to be explained that the majority of those responsible, the state powers and authorities, in order to promote the will of the economic lobby and all the institutions, companies and corporations and with regard to measures relating to the production and consumption of all economic goods, leave the population in the dark about the great danger of the corona epidemic. And the rest of the evil is done by playing down the danger of corona, by neglecting any duty to wear a protective mask and by leaving it to the will of the majority of citizens who are incapable of rational thought and knowledge. Our frightening observations in this regard in the majority of the heads of state and authorities on earth surpass all that we have ever encountered in any other people of other worlds in terms of irrationality, selfishness, irresponsibility and enrichment to the detriment of humanity. The majority of all female and male leaders of states, as well as the majority of all leaders of authorities, which we have observed worldwide and in general since the end of the last World War, continuously classify extremely precise analyses and from these classify appropriate and undoubted findings. Frighteningly only the profound realization and the result allow us to conclude that the worldwide majority of all leaders of states and authorities are unworthy and incapable of their office. His leadership intelligence in government and public administration does not correspond to the necessarily comprehensive qualities that would be necessary for the correct and humanly beneficial welfare and progress as well as for safety and health. Our investigations, analyses and findings have shown effectively that the majority of all those exercising state power and, equally, the majority of the forces of authority are not only extremely deficient in terms of their intelligence, their extremely poor and decisive quality of decision-making, leadership and action, but also correspond to an inferiority such as that of uneducated adolescents. If the whole negative of the leaders of the state and the authorities is analyzed, then no real values of general utility to the people can be discerned in them, but only selfish ends of their own, through which the majority of the leaders of the state and the higher authorities rise and shine and feel adored in their own glory, but truly do nothing for their people. However, positive decisions are made only very rarely, and consequently it is almost impossible to observe a person wearing a protective mask in public, as would be of urgency and as we have recommended and as a rule followed by FIGU members worldwide, as we can see from our frequent observations. In many cases, these members are the only ones in a wide area who responsibly follow the advice of the mask wearer, while the majority of the population recklessly walks around without masks, irresponsibly does not keep the necessary distance from other people and, moreover, groups together, thus making coronavirus infections inevitable and increasing. And the fact that the leaders and authorities responsible do nothing about this and do not make wearing a protective mask an obligation, that is not only a reckless omission of a necessary regulation, but an irresponsibility without equal, because in terms of the omission of all the necessary safety obligations towards the population and its health, this is not only irresponsible but criminal.
You can say that again. As a rule, the majority of those responsible for this or similar situations only make a lot of stupid remarks and sayings when they go public or are questioned by inquiring journalists on the matter. The rulers who are influenced in this way believe themselves to be big and clever, but they only babble stupid stuff, as I recently observed and listened to on television with various men and women from our House of Parliament, as well as with rulers from other countries. It was the same with Germany, the EU dictatorship and US oaths. And what there was talked about stupid, inconsiderate, stupid trivialities, incomprehension, irresponsible nonsense and trivialities, that made me blush with shame, also because such people are allowed to exercise state power, although they are absolutely incapable of doing so, and they would be better off doing an intelligent, circumspect, manual labor of labor.
Such observations and hearings are also under our control, and in regard to the evaluations of the statements made to the people by various state officials and members of the authorities, it must be said that they are very often not only extremely banal, but effectively ridiculous and prove the unsuitability of the persons in question with regard to their position in the state or authorities. But now, Edward, dear friend, I must go again. Farewell and protect yourself. Give my greetings to the entire figure community all around the world, and let them all follow my advice, and let them all follow our recommendations concerning the above-mentioned safety precautions, and let them thereby be able to protect themselves from the coronavirus with a certain degree of safety by wearing protective masks, and by keeping their distance from other people on all their journeys and errands etc., and wherever they go, in the best possible way. Goodbye.